Welcome to Obsessed with Assessment, the podcast on which we're obsessed with, well, you can probably guess the rest. My name is Sam Deno. I have 14 years experience working in the education industry, 6 years as a classroom teacher and 8 years in EdTech. This is a story for another day, Paul, but did you know that assessment was one of the factors that brought my teaching career crashing to an end?
I didn't know, but I'm not surprised either.
I mean, actually, how many teachers could say that? But maybe we're exercising some demons along the way. Paul Duffy, tell us about yourself.
Absolutely. Well, I was in the primary classroom for 12 years and more in a variety of capacities. Assessment was a big part of that. Was it a part of the reason I left? Do you know what? It possibly could have been, with all the many wonderful hours I spent marking books and filling in Excel spreadsheets, and perhaps some of our listeners can relate to that as well. So yes, I am now in EdTech as well, and on this journey to explore assessment with Sam here.
Shall we hear some music and then we'll get going? In this podcast, we do the legwork on assessment so that you don't have to, if you don't want to, of course. Paul and I tackle a load of reading, blogs, articles, reports, academic reading, and then we synthesize it, we chew it over, and we come up with some useful takeaways that teachers could embed into their practice. These are short episodes, so if you have 15 minutes to squeeze in some professional development, then they act as the perfect tool for that. Or you might just be interested in the fascinating subject of assessment.
So, talking of fascinating, what fascinating aspects of assessment are we looking at this week then, Sam?
So, I have been thinking about digital technology again, which I guess is becoming a bit of a preoccupation. So we work in EdTech, so maybe it's all we think about, to be honest. I actually started with this is interesting, Paul. I kind of went round the houses on this. I actually started with looking at the mental health crisis and how smartphone addiction was a big part of that. So I started with smartphone addiction, and that led me to, have you seen this? The House of Commons Education Committee have just released a report as we record on screens and what's it called? It's called Screen Time Impacts on Education and Wellbeing. Here's something. I don't want to get too sidetracked by this, but I'll tell you anyway, because this is alarming, I guess. Nearly 25%, this is from the report, nearly 25% of children and young people use their smartphones in a way that is consistent with a behavioural addiction.
Ooh.
Which is horrific, isn't it? And actually, I mean, so Paul and I, we discussed these sorts of things in private as well, would you believe it? And actually we do. We are old Luddites, aren't we? We bemoan the use of phones and the worrying effects of phones. Do you want to say anything about it, Paul?
Yeah, we could do. I mean, it's definitely prevalent, isn't it? I think we've mentioned in our private chats, you're more and more seeing kind of the younger generation on their phones rather than perhaps in conversation. So it'd be interesting to see what you've unearthed.
Well, so that is a sidetrack. That actually, what I'm really wanting to look at here is, well, it creates something of a paradox, doesn't it? Because on the one hand, we've got this report from the House of Commons Education Committee, and on the other hand, we've got a digital revolution, and it's difficult for teachers to decide, well, where do I come down on this? So in this report, it says the next government should produce a risk assessment on the use of EdTech and AI in schools as soon as possible. That's the recommendation from the report. So that is looking at screens, like I say, screen addiction, looking at AI and computing and EdTech, and saying we're worried about this. We need the next government to deal with it. As we record this again, we're in the middle of the Parliament has been dissolved and we're waiting for the next general election. So, I mean, that may age quite quickly. But you've got that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, in an earlier podcast that we recorded, we spoke about this Cambridge University Press Futures of Assessment document, in which we discussed what the future of assessment might look like, and it was all on computers basically, and it looked ahead to 2050, and it considered that by that point, that everything could be digitized, everything that could be used remotely, assessment could be done, on the hoof, kind of as and when on a computer. So we've got this, it causes something of a paradox, doesn't it? It causes this digital technology. Well, how do we use it? The recommendation to the government is that we shouldn't be using it too much, and yet the future of education looks like it is going to be almost entirely on computers.
Are there some positives to be seen in, the reforms and sort of change towards more of a digital-based education landscape?
It's a good question, yeah. So I think you and I can both see that screen technology does offer loads of advantages to educators and learners. And I'm not just saying that because I work in EdTech, although I do. But and this is what the Futures of Assessment report was kind of gunning for as well. Personalised learning, fast-track marking, remote learning where pupils can't access education in satisfactorily, multimedia tools for engagement in the classroom. There are so many positives that can be taken from computers and from screens. But if it's used wrongly or if it's overused, then it could be incredibly damaging. And so it was this that led me to exploring digital technology in relation to formative assessment. So that's going to be I'm halfway through my pod, but so that's going to be my main focus from now, Paul, from now.
Okay.
So I turned to some research by a chap called Gavin Brown, who has a particular interest in psychology and education. Gavin Brown says reliance on a computer interface as the sole means of assessment or teaching may dehumanize the very human experience of learning and teaching. So obviously that's very much pointing towards the importance of the human experience, and we've discussed that lots of times, haven't we? As we've discussed formative assessment, as we've discussed the partnership between the pupil and the educator and the learning cycle. It's all so dependent on that human touch. He also says computer testing neglects school curriculum and classroom contexts where most education takes place and where insights are needed by both teachers and learners. And his point is that when you carry out formative testing in a traditional classroom, you can mitigate to some extent against psychological factors. And this is something that's very big for Gavin Brown. He's like I say, he's very interested in the psychology of education. And what he says is that you can't, well, you can, but you shouldn't take assessment out of context. There is always context to assessment. There's always psychological context to assessment. So, for example, a pupil will always be influenced by the people that are sitting near them. They may well be influenced by what has been going on in their personal lives. They may be influenced by the environmental factors in the classroom or in the exam hall or whatever. You can't take that context away. And yet the data that we look at, and this is one of the problems with summative assessment, I guess, the data that we look at disregards all of that context and just shows us data. Now, in a classroom where you're doing formative assessment, if it's a formative assessment set by a teacher, then that teacher can mitigate against some of those factors and remove some of the obstacles, or be aware at least of some of the obstacles. Again, it's that teaching partnership between the teacher and the child. If you then suddenly stick that on a computer, say one of these many testing apps that are springing up in the marketplace right now, stick that on a computer, you're removing a lot of that psychological stuff. You're removing all of those factors. In particular, if you send a child home with an online quiz, then you're not going to see those circumstances. It's not a learning partnership anymore. It's a computer and it's a child, and that psychological, the awareness of the psychology of it is removed from the equation, and that's quite critical when it comes to, well, how do you help that child develop further as they go forwards?
So interestingly, I've kind of had experience of both of these things that you've mentioned from Gavin Brown, in terms of the kind of psychological and contextual factors around assessment. Certainly, I remember I did a reading assessment one year, and the school had just purchased this lovely shiny new app to use on the computers, and we got there and the children got horrendous reading grades, and it was primarily down to the fact that they didn't have the computer skills to be able to click the buttons in time to get a high enough score, and then the fact that this was so novel to them, suddenly going into an IT suite in silence to do a reading quiz, that they didn't perform as well. And I'd kind of done the classroom based version and they got comparatively much higher scores. So I think I can totally see what Gavin Brown is saying there. And in the same way as, using kind of online quizzing at home, I think I'm not sure as a teacher, and I don't know whether you've experienced this in secondary, kind of how trustworthy I would say that data is if there's been no teacher input. So I think that idea of the personalisation with the teacher being involved is, really key. Is there any more kind of on the fact that teachers need to be involved?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, I'm gonna get into the key takeaways very shortly, because I think that very much is part of my recommendation, really, with the way that we use this sort of technology in formative assessment. I suppose that the last thing that I was going to say, and this plays into exactly what you've just said, is, again, from this House of Commons Education Committee report that's very recent. There are over 500,000 apps claiming to be educational within leading app stores such as the Apple App Store and Google Play, but no quality standards for educational content or design features that apps must align with to be included in the educational category. So it's the Wild West out there in terms of these so-called educational apps. Now, actually, what I'm gonna recommend flies in the face of that, because actually I don't think we should be ditching this stuff. Actually, I think that, as I've probably said before, that as soon as you choose not to embrace technology, you will become outdated very quickly within the times that we live, So we use this phrase digital revolution, and it is here, and we can't just say, no, we're not going to use it, because then we'll become outdated very quickly. I will go straight then to the key takeaways, which is that. So Gavin Brown then believes that EdTech needs to develop technology that supports what humans must do in schooling, rather than replace them with teaching, testing machines. So technology to support, technology we can't get rid of. So how do we use it to support? So practically, what does that look like? And like I say, I would advocate for embracing digital technology. Embrace apps that offer platforms for low stakes testing. Having said everything I've just said, again, we do work. Paul and I work in EdTech. We work for Twinkle, and they're currently working with an organisation called Educate, which is one such platform. So we're trying to build an integrated resourcing and testing ecosystem. And there's numerous other quiz softwares out there. So I would say get on board with them. But there's a caveat. If you do choose to use a quizzing app, do so with care. Know how it functions before setting tasks and try to get as much insight into the diagnostics that it offers. So it's on the teacher to know how that software works before they roll it out. A computer doesn't know your pupils as well as you do, so make sure you know how that computer works. Try to use quizzing apps in the classroom. As you would do with peer or self-assessment. It's preferable for formative assessment to take place in an environment that you have a control over. Again, there's those psychological factors. If it's in your classroom, then you're aware and you can mitigate against the psychological factors. And then the last one I was going to mention was teachers. I think that teachers should encourage pupils to use educational apps. They should say, yeah, go on the app store, go and find yourself an app, but be in dialogue with your pupils about it. Again, it's a learning partnership. Talk about what they use, how they use it, whether they find it useful or not. And that sort of honest conversation is actually all part of building up that educational journey. That's everything I've got. What, Paul, have you got anything extra?
Do you know what? I was going to say, thank you so much. I think that's some really deep insight into using EdTech in a really good way. And what I love is that it circles back to, you know, what we kind of looked at before with the fact that the whole idea of assessment coming from that last Latin word, acidere, that we're guiding, we're sitting alongside our pupils, and that actually if we're introducing EdTech, if we're using these apps, it's part of, you know, many tools for us to guide our pupils. It's not something that we leave them with and go, here you go, here's this tool, it's going to help you learn. Actually, we as teachers, as educators, as parents are still coming alongside and guiding our learners. And, you know, the points you've made about careful consideration, I think are absolutely vital. So yeah, thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. Comments, if you want to, comments. I'm not sure where you can comment. If you can find a box to comment on or in, then please do so. Like and subscribe. We like your feedback and we like to engage. So please do get in touch. And that's it. Bye for now.
Bye for now.